The high oversight Citadel did not just house the law, it breathed it. The air inside the main atrium was pressurized, filtered through silver-plated scrubbers that stripped away the grit and humidity of the lower wards, replacing it with a scent that Selim Jace always associated with cold metal and expensive ozone. It was the smell of power, sterile, untouchable, and utterly indifferent to the millions living beneath its foundations. Selim stood in the center of the geometric floor, his boots leaving faint, oily smudges on the white marble. He was 19, with skin the color of aged mahogany and eyes that had seen too many graveyard shifts. He was wearing the drab, slate-gray coveralls of a Level 1 maintenance technician, a uniform designed to make the wearer blend into the machinery they serviced. To the people walking past him in tailored silks and Neuralink glasses, Selim was no more significant than a wall panel or a floor vent. He was a utility. Some unranked grease monkey wandered into the sanctum of the law. Secure the perimeter before the stench of the lower wards ruins the morning. The voice belonged to Magistrate Orion Krell. It was a voice honed by decades of delivering sentences, a baritone that carried the weight of absolute authority. Krell stood on the mezzanine, looking down at Selim with the same clinical distaste one might reserve for a leaking pipe. The lobby, a cathedral of glass and ego, went silent. Advocates paused mid-sentence. Security drones hovered in place. Every eye in the atrium turned toward Selim. Selim felt the heat rise in his chest, but his hands remained steady around the battered data slate he held against his ribs. He didn't look up. He knew the protocol. Level 1s were to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, and their presence minimal. Krell snapped his fingers. A sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed like a whip crack against the marble. Purge this industrial waste from the halls before it finds something valuable to pocket, he sneered. A ripple of cruel, curated laughter moved through the circle of onlookers. It was a soft, polite sound, the kind of laughter that only exists in places where people have forgotten what it's like to have dirt under their fingernails. Two armored enforcers detached themselves from the pillars, their heavy magnetic boots thudding toward Selim with mechanical precision. "Wait!" Selim started, his voice cracking slightly before he found his rhythm. "I have a clearance override for the—" "You have a clearance to be invisible?" Krell interrupted, his smirk widening as he adjusted his chronometer. A device worth more than Selim's entire residential block. This is a forum for those who build the world, not those who merely sweep up its debris. Get him out. As the enforcers gripped Selim's arms, their gloved hands squeezing with unnecessary force, Selim caught Krell's gaze. For a fraction of a second, the magistrate saw something in the boy's eyes that wasn't fear. It was observation. Selim wasn't just being insulted. He was recording. He was noting the way Krell's left eyelid flicked when he was angry, the specific serial number on the magistrate's chronometer, and the fact that the secure data slate Krell thought was private was currently broadcasting a low-frequency handshake to a nearby server. They dragged Selim toward the atmospheric scrubbers of the exit, the laughter of the elite following him like a physical weight. As the heavy blast doors hissed shut, separating Selim from the marble sanctuary, Krell turned back to his colleagues, already forgetting the grease monkey existed. He didn't know that the data slate Selim held contained the encrypted death warrants of Krell's own career. To understand how Selim Jace became the most dangerous person in the Citadel, one had to look at his life in the subsector. At 4 o'clock, while the elite of the upper tiers slept in gravity-neutralized beds, Selim sat at a dented metal table in a room that smelled of recycled air and old copper. His apartment was a 4x4 cube located in the shadow of the massive cooling fins that kept the city from overheating. The constant hum of the turbines was the soundtrack of his life. He wasn't sleeping. He was immersed in deep-layer architectural law and planetary statutes. Selim possessed a cognitive anomaly known in the medical wards as high-fidelity synaptic retention. In the subsector, they just called it the loop. His brain acted as a high-definition recorder. Every schematic he repaired, every legal brief he glanced at while dusting a desk, every whispered conversation between corrupt officials in the soundproof lounges. It was all stored, indexed, and searchable in his mind. His father had been a foundryman who died when a containment field failed because of a budgetary adjustment signed by the Oversight Board. On his deathbed, his father hadn't left him money or land. He had left him a single piece of advice. In this city, they look at you, but they don't see you. Use that. Be the ghost in their machine. Learn their rules better than they know them, and one day, you'll be the one holding the pen. Selim had taken that to heart. While his peers sought escape in the neon-lit gambling dens of the lower levels, Selim spent his credits on black market legal databases and tutoring modules. He had memorized the Morrison precedents, the Vallon statutes, and the obscure Oversight Rule 614, a material witness incursion clause that hadn't been used in a century. His current assignment was the Vallon Research Spire, the crown jewel of the city's technological sector. His supervisor was Dr. Soren Vallon, a man who had pioneered the very atmospheric scrubbers that made the upper tiers livable. Unlike the other elites, Dr. Vallon actually saw Selim. "You're late with the filter diagnostic, Jace." Vallon would say, not with malice, but with a weary sort of kindness. Vallon was a man of integrity in a city built on graft. He was currently being targeted by the Oversight Committee for financial irregularities, a transparent attempt by Magistrate Krell and his associates to seize Vallon's patents and privatize the city's oxygen supply. Over the months, as Selim worked in the crawlspaces of Vallon's office, he had seen the truth. He had seen the way Inquisitor Jada Hallow, the prosecution's lead, had visited Vallon's office after hours. Selim had been inside the ventilation duct, silent as a shadow, as Hallow used a biometric spoofer to access Vallon's private accounts. He hadn't just watched. He had recorded the timestamps. He had seen the way Hallow's hands trembled, not from guilt, but from the adrenaline of the theft. Selim knew the sauce of the story. This wasn't just about a doctor being framed. It was about a systemic purge. Krell and Hallow were clearing the board of anyone with a conscience. And Selim, the invisible technician, was the only one with the receipts. The trial of the people versus Dr. Soren Vallon began on a Tuesday. The courtroom was a masterpiece of intimidation, high-backed obsidian chairs, holographic displays that projected evidence in three-dimensional light, and a jury box filled with impartial citizens who all happened to have financial ties to Krell's investment firms. Inquisitor Jada Hallow opened the proceedings with a performance that would have won awards in the theater districts. She paced the floor, her heels clicking like a metronome. "Dr. Vallon didn't just steal credits," she announced, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "He stole the very breath from our children's lungs. He funneled maintenance funds meant for your safety, into offshore shell accounts to fund his own private eccentricities." She displayed a financial chart. To the jury, it looked like an airtight trail of greed. To Selim, sitting in the very back row of the gallery in his suit, his one suit navy blue and smelling slightly of mothballs, the chart was a joke. He recognized the encryption headers. They were the same ones used by the Oversight Board's own internal slush fund. Vallon's defense was led by Advocate Silas, a man who looked like he had been defeated long before he entered the room. Silas was competent, but he was playing by the old rules. He was trying to prove Vallon's character. "My client has spent 40 years serving the city," Silas argued, his voice thin. "Character is not a currency that can pay for embezzlement, Advocate." Magistrate Krell interrupted from the bench, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Do you have evidence of a clerical error? Or are we just here for a eulogy?" The prosecution's star witness was Kale, Vallon's former chief assistant. Kale took the stand and, with a rehearsed tremor in his voice, testified that he had seen Vallon signing the illegal transfers. Selim closed his eyes. In his mind, he pulled up the file from 3 weeks ago. He had been repairing the logic node in the Spire's secondary server room. He had seen Kale meeting with Hallow. He had recorded the audio of Hallow promising Kale a Tier 4 residency and a clean record for his brother in exchange for this testimony. Selim looked at his data slate. He had a choice. He could stay silent, finish his apprenticeship, and eventually escape to another city. Or he could stand up and be the grease monkey who broke the machine. He remembered his mother's face this morning. Their residential block had been rezoned by Krell's committee. They were being evicted to make room for a new high-rise for the Citadel's security staff. "It's about justice, Mama," he had told her. She had looked at him, terrified. "Justice is for people who can afford it, Selim." "No," Selim whispered to himself in the courtroom. "Justice is for people who can't be ignored." As Inquisitor Hallow prepared to rest her case, Selim Jace stood up. The movement was small, but in the silence of the courtroom, it was seismic. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was a level 1. He was unranked. "Your Honor," Selim said, his voice projecting with a clarity that surprised even himself. "I invoke Oversight Rule 614. Material Witness Incursion." The silence that followed was absolute. Krell froze. Hallow turned, her eyes narrowing as she tried to place the face of the boy in the navy suit. "Who is this?" Krell demanded, his face reddening. "Security, remove this spectator." "You can't remove a material witness who has invoked 614, Magistrate," Selim said, stepping into the aisle. He began reciting the statute from memory, word for word, comma for comma. "Any citizen, regardless of rank, who possesses direct evidence of digital tampering or perjury in a capital oversight case, may petition for immediate inclusion." Selim looked Krell directly in the eye. "And I have the logs to prove that every piece of evidence presented today was manufactured in your own office." The air in Courtroom 7 seemed to solidify. Magistrate Krell's face transitioned from a mask of aristocratic boredom to a dark, mottled crimson. The silence was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a vacuum before a hull breach. Every high-ranking official, every sensor drone, and every silk-clad spectator was fixed on Selim Jace. "You dare!" Krell's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "You stand in the highest oversight citadel, dressed in a suit that costs less than my gavel, and you attempt to subvert a capital proceeding with a 19th-century procedural relic?" "It is not a relic, Your Honor," Selim replied. He stepped further into the well of the court, the polished obsidian floor reflecting his navy suit. Rule 614 was drafted during the reconstruction of the lower wards specifically to prevent the weaponization of digital evidence against those who lack the neural links to verify it. It is the bedrock of the very bench you sit upon. Inquisitor Jada Hallow recovered her composure with practiced ease. She smoothed the front of her charcoal blazer and stepped towards Selim, her eyes cold as liquid nitrogen. "Magistrate, this is a transparent stalling tactic. This boy is a technician, a level 1 maintenance worker at the Valen Spire. He is likely an accomplice of Dr. Valen, attempting to introduce fabricated data to save his employer's neck." Selim didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on Krell. "I am not an accomplice. I am a witness to the fabrication. While I was repairing the secondary logic node in the Spire secure server room on the 14th of last month, I witnessed Inquisitor Hallow herself accessing Dr. Valen's private terminals at 2315. She used a Model 9 biometric spoofer, a device illegal for anyone below a Tier 5 oversight auditor to possess. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Hallow's eyes flickered, a momentary lapse that Selim's high-fidelity synaptic retention recorded with surgical precision. "Absurd!" Hallow shouted. "I was at the Oversight Gala on the 14th. There are 300 witnesses. You were at the gala until 2245, Selim countered instantly. You exited through the service corridor, wearing a level 3 maintenance jumpsuit, much like the one I wear for work. You entered the spire through the ventilation scrubbers. You didn't realize that the scrubbers were undergoing a diagnostic cycle. I was inside the duct, recalibrating the sensors. I didn't just see you, Inquisitor. I recorded your handshake with the server." Selim tapped his data slate. A holographic projection bloomed in the center of the courtroom. It wasn't a grainy video. It was a raw data stream, a cascading waterfall of golden code. "This is the handshake signature of the spoofer," Selim explained, his voice becoming the steady, analytical tone of a technician. "Every biometric override leaves a ghost frequency. This signature matches the serial number of a device checked out from the Oversight Evidence Locker 3 months ago. By your office, Magistrate Krell." The courtroom erupted. Advocate Silas, sensing the shift in the tide, stood up. Your Honor, in light of this extraordinary material testimony, the defense moves for an immediate digital forensic audit of the prosecution's evidence. Krell pounded his gavel with such force the sound echoed like a gunshot. Order! I will not have this court turned into a technical circus by a boy who spends his days cleaning pipes. But the seeds were sown. The jury, a group of people who had been carefully chosen for their loyalty to the status quo, were looking at the data slate. They were residents of this city. They knew that technical logs didn't lie. The court is in recess for 2 hours while the oversight clerk verifies the validity of Rule 614. Krell announced, his voice tight. Security, escort the witness to the detention lounge. He is not to speak to anyone. The detention lounge was a misnomer. It was a cold, windowless room in the sub-basement of the Citadel, reinforced with dampening fields that cut off all external communications. Selim sat on a hard bench, his data slate resting on his knees. He knew he was in extreme danger. In this city, people like him didn't just go home after accusing the magistrate and the inquisitor of a conspiracy. The door hissed open. Selim expected the enforcers, but instead, it was Advocate Silas. The man looked frantic, his hair disheveled. Jace, do you have any idea what you've done? Silas whispered, checking over his shoulder as the door sealed shut. You haven't just attacked Hallow. You've attacked the entire oversight infrastructure. If that data is real, it implicates the board in the privatization of the oxygen scrubbers. They will kill you before you take the stand again. The data is real, Silas, Selim said, his voice calm. And it's already been distributed. Silas froze. What? I'm a maintenance tech, Selim said with a small, grim smile. We know how the plumbing works. Not just the water pipes, but the data pipes. When I activated Rule 614, I triggered an automated transparency burst. The raw logs I just showed in court were simultaneously uploaded to the subsector public bulletin boards and the Independent Scholars Archive. If I disappear, the decryption key is sent to every newsfeed in the lower tiers. Selim stood up, pacing the small room. They think I'm just a grease monkey. They think because I live in a 4x4 cube that I'm uneducated. But I've spent every night for 5 years reading their own laws. I know how to protect myself, Silas. The question is, are you brave enough to actually defend Dr. Vallon? Or are you just waiting for your paycheck? Silas looked at the boy, and for the first time in 20 years of legal practice, he felt a spark of the idealism that had driven him to the law in the first place. He straightened his tie. Tell me exactly what else you saw in those ducks, Selim. For the next hour, Selim reconstructed the conspiracy. He detailed the secret meetings between Krell and the executives of the EtherCorp, the company that stood to gain the most from Vallon's downfall. He described the dead-drop locations in the industrial sectors where Kale, the assistant, had been paid in untraceable credits. Selim's memory was a weapon. He recalled the exact denominations of the bills, the serial numbers on the credit chips, and the license plates of the hovercars used by the conspirators. It's not just a frame-up, Selim concluded. It's a hostile takeover of the city's life support system. Vallon was the only thing standing in their way because he refused to charge the subsector for breathable air. They didn't just want him in prison. They wanted his reputation destroyed, so no one would ever question their emergency management of the spire. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. News of the transparency burst had hit the streets. Outside the Citadel, a crowd of thousands had gathered. The invisible people of the subsector, the workers, the technicians, and the families who lived in the shadow of the scrubbers. They were chanting a name they had only just learned. Jace. Magistrate Krell looked older. His skin was pale and he refused to look at the gallery. The oversight clerk, a neutral official who took their orders from the planetary high court, stood before the bench. Your Honor, the clerk said, their voice echoing through the chamber. The forensic audit of the logs provided by Selim Jace has been completed. The handshake signatures are authentic. Furthermore, a deep scan of the prosecution's evidence files reveals phantom timestamps, indicators that the files were backdated from a central server belonging to the Oversight Committee. Inquisitor Hallow stood up, her face a mask of rage. This is a breach of security. The auditor has no right to. Sit down, Inquisitor, Krell interrupted, his voice hollow. He knew the game was over. The mob outside was too large, the evidence too public. If he tried to suppress it now, the city would burn. Selim was called back to the witness stand. This time, there was no laughter. Mr. Jace, Advocate Silas began, his voice now booming with newfound authority. You stated that you saw Inquisitor Hallow at the Spire on the 14th. Can you tell the court what she was doing specifically? She wasn't just planting evidence, Selim said, leaning into the microphone. She was installing a backdoor protocol into the main scrubber logic. If Dr. Valen were found guilty, the Spire would enter a fail-safe mode that could only be overridden by an oversight director. It would have given Krell total control over the city's oxygen levels. Selim turned to the jury. They called me waste. They called me uneducated. But I'm the one who fixed the machines they used to steal your future. I'm the one who recorded the truth because I was invisible to them. They forgot that the people who build the world are the ones who know how it really works. The verdict was reached in less than 10 minutes. Not guilty. But the story didn't end there. As Dr. Valen was embraced by his colleagues, the oversight enforcers, under orders from the Planetary High Court, entered the courtroom. They didn't go for Selim. They went for Krell and Hallow. Orion Krell, Jada Hallow, you are under arrest for high treason, conspiracy to endanger public health, and digital forgery, the lead enforcer announced. As they were led away in shackles, Krell passed Selim. He stopped for a moment, looking at the boy in the navy suit. You've destroyed everything, Krell hissed. No, Selim replied softly. I just cleaned the filters. 3 months later, the high oversight Citadel looked the same, but the air felt different. The silver-plated scrubbers were still there, but they were now managed by a public trust led by Dr. Valen. Selim Jace stood on the mezzanine where Krell had once stood. He wasn't wearing coveralls. He was wearing the formal robes of a junior advocate. He had been granted a full scholarship to the Central Academy of Jurisprudence, not as a charity case, but as a recognition of his unparalleled mastery of the law. He had become a symbol for the subsector, proof that knowledge was the ultimate equalizer. He looked down at the atrium. A group of Level 1 technicians were working on a floor panel. They looked up at him, and Selim didn't look away. He didn't see utility. He saw people. He saw his peers. His mother moved into a new apartment in the mid-tiers, one with a view of the sun that wasn't blocked by cooling fins. Selim still visited the subsector every weekend, teaching legal literacy classes to the children of the foundries. He had realized that his high-fidelity memory wasn't just for recording crimes. It was for preserving the stories of the people the city tried to forget. He was no longer the ghost in the machine. He was the architect of a new system, one where the law wasn't a weapon for the elite, but a shield for the invisible. The weight of silence had been replaced by the power of a voice that refused to be quieted. And as Selim Jace looked out over the sprawling city, he knew that the next time someone was called waste, he would be there to ensure the world saw their worth. The Central Academy of Jurisprudence was a fortress of ivory and tempered glass, perched on the highest spire of the upper tiers. Here, the air was so pure it felt thin, lacking the metallic tang that defined Selim's life in the subsector. The floors were not marble, but a semi-translucent composite that changed color according to the mood of the planetary sun. When Selim Jace walked through the archway, his junior advocate robes felt heavy. He was the first student in the Academy's 300-year history to be admitted without a family lineage or a corporate sponsorship. To the other students, the Silks, as they were called, he was a curiosity, a political statement in human form. His primary rival was Vane Valerius, the son of the city's chief architect. Vane was a masterpiece of genetic and social engineering. Tall, sharp-featured, with a voice that had been trained from birth to command. The scholarship student, Vane remarked during their first seminar on metropolitan sovereignty. He didn't look up from his crystal data tablet. I hear you're quite a legend in the maintenance ducts, Jace. Tell me, does the law look different when you're looking at it from inside a sewer pipe? The lecture hall went quiet. The other students, dressed in their pristine, family-crested tunics, waited for the blow-up. They expected Selim to be aggressive, to show the lower-tier temper they had been taught to fear. Selim didn't even blink. He adjusted his own battered data slate, the same one that had brought down a magistrate. The law looks exactly the same, Valerius. The only difference is that from the sewer, you can see where the waste actually comes from. Up here, everyone is too busy looking at the clouds to notice the foundation is rotting. The professor, a woman named Magistrate Alara, watched from the podium with a faint, unreadable smile. She had been the one to insist on Selim's admission. "Enough," she said, her voice like velvet-covered steel. "Today we discuss the EtherCorp mandates. Mr. Jace, since you have practical experience with the scrubbers, perhaps you can explain the legal loophole used to justify the Tier 4 oxygen tax." Selim stood. He didn't need notes. His memory unfolded the document like a map. The tax was justified under the Emergency Atmospheric Preservation Act of 2104, specifically Section 8, which allows for variable cost recovery based on the altitude of the recipient. The loophole is in the definition of altitude. It's measured relative to the planetary core, not the city floor. Since the subsector is physically closer to the core, they are legally classified as basement dwellers, which carries a 40% surcharge for oxygen pumping. He paused, looking directly at Vane. It wasn't a preservation act. It was a geography-based wealth extraction system. And according to the Morrison precedent, any tax based on immutable physical location without a corresponding service upgrade is unconstitutional. Vane's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the grease monkey to know the Morrison precedent. For the next 4 hours, the two of them debated with a ferocity that left the other students silent. It was a clash of two worlds, one built on the tradition of power and one forged in the fire of survival. While Selim studied the law, the shadows of the old regime were not idle. Orion Krell and Jada Hallow were in the high-security detention facility, but their influence was like a slow-acting virus. The EtherCorp had lost their privatization contract, but they still owned the patents for the scrubber filters. In a move of calculated spite, they began a controlled phase-out of the older filter models, the ones used exclusively in the subsector. Reports began trickling into Selim's former maintenance unit. His mentor, Dr. Valen, contacted him through a secure link. "Selim, it's not just a supply chain issue." Valen's hollow image appeared in Selim's dorm room, looking tired and frail. "They've triggered a planned obsolescence routine in the firmware. In 30 days, the subsector scrubbers will simply stop recognizing the filters. We can't even manufacture replacements because the encryption is proprietary." Selim felt the old coldness in his chest. This was the true face of the enemy. They didn't need to arrest people. They just needed to make the world unlivable for them. "I'm on it, Doctor," Selim said. That night, Selim didn't study for his midterms. He went back to the only place where he felt truly powerful, the digital archives. He spent 16 hours straight, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the screen. He was looking for the ghost signature, the hidden lines of code that Krell had mentioned during his arrest. He found it buried in a 200-year-old municipal charter. There was a clause called the Universal Utility Covenant. It stated that if a private corporation held a patent on a life-critical system, and that corporation failed to provide service, the patent was automatically forfeited to the public domain. But there was a catch. The forfeiture had to be triggered by a sitting member of the High Oversight Board. And since Krell's arrest, the board was deadlocked, unable to appoint a successor. "They're stalling the appointments on purpose," Selim realized. As long as the board is empty, the covenant can't be triggered. The subsector runs out of air. EtherCorp declares an emergency takeover, and the cycle starts again. Selim knew he couldn't wait for the academy to teach him how to solve this. He needed to force the board's hand. He needed a material witness of a different kind. The final confrontation took place not in a small courtroom, but in the Supreme Tribunal, a floating chamber that overlooked the entire city. Below, the sprawling lights of the subsector flickered, unaware that their air supply was counting down. Selim Jace stood before the three grand justices. He wasn't there as a student. He had petitioned the court as a pro se representative for the 3 million residents of the subsector. The lead counsel for EtherCorp was Atticus Thorne, a man who had never lost a case in 40 years. Wait. No, I'll name him Atticus Vesper. Thorne is on the forbidden list. Atticus Vesper was a giant in the legal world, known for his ability to make a contract for murder look like a charitable donation. The petitioner's argument is based on sentiment, not law. Vesper began, his voice smooth and condescending. EtherCorp is a private entity. We cannot be forced to manufacture obsolete technology at a loss. If the subsector cannot afford the new Tier 1 upgrades, that is a municipal failure, not a corporate one. Selim stepped to the podium. He felt the eyes of the city on him. The trial was being broadcast to every screen, from the penthouse suites to the foundry floor. Mr. Vesper is correct about one thing, Selim said. This is a municipal failure, but the failure isn't in the budget. It's in the memory of this court. Selim tapped his slate. I present Exhibit A, the original deed of the Valen Research Spire, dated 2088. It wasn't built by a corporation. It was built by a public-private partnership using subsector labor and subsector tax credits. He zoomed into a microscopic line of text at the bottom of the deed. There is a reversionary interest clause here that has been redacted in every digital copy for 50 years. But it's still in the physical archives, printed on paper that hasn't been touched since the city was founded. Selim looked at the Grand Justices. This clause states that if the spire ever ceases to provide equitable service to all tiers, the land, and all technology developed upon it, reverts to the workers who built it. That's a fabrication, Vesper shouted, his composure finally breaking. Is it? Selim asked. I invite the court to send an independent drone to archive Vault 9B. I spent 12 hours there yesterday. I didn't just read the deed. I memorized the fiber pattern of the paper. You'll find the original, unredacted document in the third drawer from the left. The silence in the tribunal was heavy. The grand justices conferred in whispers. A drone was dispatched. 10 minutes later, the holographic display in the center of the room flickered to life. It showed the physical deed. The redaction had been achieved through a simple chemical wash that was invisible to digital scanners. But under ultraviolet light, the words reversionary interest glowed like a neon sign. Selim didn't stop there. I move for the immediate seizure of EtherCorp's atmospheric patents under the Universal Utility Covenant. And I move for the permanent dissolution of the Oversight Board's power to privatize life-critical resources. The Grand Justice, a man who had seen the city rise and fall, looked at Selim with a mixture of awe and respect. Mr. Jace, you are asking us to rewrite the economic foundation of this city. No, Your Honor, Selim said. I'm asking you to finally follow the one you already have. The ruling was a landslide. The Jace Decree, as it came to be known, didn't just save the subsector's air. It established a new legal category, human necessity rights. EtherCorp was dismantled, its assets reorganized into a public utility managed by a board of technicians and scientists. Dr. Valen was appointed as the first High Commissioner of Atmosphere. Selim Jace graduated from the academy a year early. On graduation day, he didn't attend the formal gala in the upper tiers. Instead, he went back to the subsector. He stood in front of the foundry where his father had worked. A group of young maintenance workers, their coveralls stained with grease and hope, gathered around him. They'll tell you that you're just parts of a machine, Selim told them. They'll tell you that you're invisible because you're at the bottom. But remember this, a machine can't run without its parts, but the parts can build a new machine whenever they want. He looked up at the high oversight Citadel. It was no longer a fortress of exclusion. It was a lighthouse. Selim Jace was no longer a grease monkey. He was the man who had taught the law how to breathe. And as he walked through the streets of his home, he knew that the silence was finally over. The city was speaking, and for the first time in its history, everyone was listening. The victory in the Supreme Tribunal had shifted the city's axis, but as Selim Jace quickly learned, laws changed much faster than people. While the Jace decree was being coded into the city's central mainframe, a different kind of resistance was brewing in the mid-tier processing plants. Selim was now a fixture in the Academy's high-altitude libraries, but his heart remained tethered to the subsector. He spent his nights translating complex legal jargon into shop talk, manuals that explained worker rights using the metaphors of torque, pressure, and flow. One evening, a familiar notification pulsed on his data slate. It was an emergency override from Kale, the former assistant who had testified against Dr. Vallon. After the trial, Kale had been granted a restricted work release, helping Dr. Vallon oversee the new public oxygen trust. Selim, they're bypassing the hardware. Kale's voice was whispered, accompanied by a grainy video feed from the Sector 4 pump station. The old EtherCorp loyalists didn't leave. They just went deeper. They're introducing a ghost load into the scrubbers. It makes the sensors think the air is clean, but the oxygen saturation is dropping by 0.1% every hour. It's too slow for the automated alarms to catch, but in a week, the subsector will be too lethargic to resist anything. Selim looked at the law books surrounding him. He realized that a junior advocate's robe couldn't fix a ghost load. He needed to go back to the grease. Selim didn't go to the authorities. He knew the mid-tier police were still on the EtherCorp pension plan. Instead, he reached into his locker and pulled out his old, oil-stained Level 1 coveralls. Stepping back into the subsector felt like breathing for the first time in months. The hum of the turbines wasn't just noise. It was a heartbeat. He met Kale at the intake manifold of Sector 4. If we trip the manual override, the High Oversight Citadel will see it as an act of industrial sabotage, Kale warned, his hands shaking as he handed Selim a thermal cutter. You'll lose your scholarship. You'll be back in the pits for good. The scholarship doesn't matter if the people it's meant to represent can't breathe, Selim said. He crawled into the primary intake vent, a space so narrow he had to exhale just to move his shoulders. Using his high-fidelity memory, Selim navigated the maze of pipes in total darkness. He didn't need a map. He remembered the layout of the sector from a repair job he'd done 3 years ago. He found the ghost load device, a small, sleek black box spliced directly into the neural link of the scrubber. It bore the seal of the Architects Guild, the very organization Vane Valerius's father led. Just as Selim reached for the device, the vent's internal lights flared to a blinding white. I wondered if you'd find it, Jace. The voice came through the vent's internal comms. It was Vane Valerius. My father built this city. Vane's voice was calm, devoid of its usual courtroom theatricality. He understands that balance requires sacrifice. The subsector is an engine, Selim, and sometimes to keep the engine from overheating you have to vent the excess pressure. We aren't killing them, we're just slowing them down, making the city manageable. You're suffocating your own foundation, Vane, Selim shouted into the darkness, his fingers working frantically to bypass the box's security shielding. If the subsector fails, who's going to maintain the gravity wells? Who's going to keep the Citadel from falling out of the sky? We have droids for that now, Vane replied. Droids don't cite the Morrison precedent. Droids don't stand up in court. You were a fluke, Selim, an error in the code. And I'm here to debug the system. The vent began to vibrate. Selim felt a surge of heat. Vane was triggering a thermal purge, a blast of 400-degree steam designed to clean the vents of organic debris. Selim had 30 seconds before the steam reached his sector. His mind raced through every schematic he had ever memorized. He didn't try to remove the box. He knew Vane had booby-trapped the physical connection. Instead, he used his data slate to send a high-frequency pulse to the city's emergency broadcast system. He didn't send a message. He sent the raw, unencrypted audio of Vane's confession. He routed the signal through the very ghost load device Vane had installed. He used the enemy's own hardware as a megaphone. Across the city, in the luxury towers, in the academy libraries, and on every street corner in the subsector, Vane's voice rang out. We aren't killing them, we're just slowing them down, making the city manageable. The thermal purge clicked. The hiss of the steam began. Selim braced himself, but the blast never came. Suddenly, the vents groaned. The turbines stalled. From the other side of the comms, Selim heard a frantic shouting, then the sound of heavy boots. "This is Dr. Soren Valen." A new voice boomed over the emergency channel. "I have assumed emergency control of the Sector 4 grid. Vane Valerius, you are being detained by the Public Trust Security. Selim, get out of there. Now." The fallout from the vent scandal was the final nail in the coffin for the old aristocracy. Vane's father was forced into exile, and the Architects Guild was placed under the oversight of the maintenance unions. Selim emerged from the vent covered in soot and sweat, but he was smiling. He didn't lose his scholarship. In fact, the Academy created a new chair in his honor, the Department of Ethical Infrastructure. The story of Selim Jace became a legend. It wasn't just a justice story about a boy who won a trial. It was the story of the man who proved that, in a city of millions, no one is truly invisible unless they choose to be silent. Years later, a young technician, a girl with a wrench and a data slate, walked into Selim's office at the Citadel. She looked at his junior advocate robes and then at the framed, oil-stained coveralls on his wall. "They told me I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me the law isn't for people like me." Selim Jace stood up, the same way he had stood up in Courtroom 7 all those years ago. He smiled at her, a look of recognition in his eyes. "They're wrong," Selim said, handing her a seat at his desk. "The law is exactly for people like us. Now, tell me, what did you see in the machines today?"